Today, we are definitely tackling a complex one. We're looking at the American electrical grid.
Right, that enormous, sprawling, and let's face it, mostly invisible system that basically powers everything in modern American life. We're going deep into Gretchen Bakke's book, The Grid, the fraying wires between Americans and our energy future.
It's a fascinating read because it really unpacks why this system, this absolute bedrock of our society, is struggling so much right now.
It really is a paradox, isn't it? The scale is just immense. Think about it. Data centers, finance, hospitals, travel, everything relies on it.
Everything.
Yeah.
Yet, as Bake puts it, we barely even notice it. It's the world's largest machine and the 20th century's greatest engineering achievement, but it's just background noise for most people.
Like seeing power lines against a sunset. You see them, but you don't see them. They don't register as this critical piece of machinery.
Exactly. And that success, that invisibility, is kind of masking a really deep fragility. That's our mission today, right? To sort of peel back the layers.
Yeah, to look at the grid not just as wires and towers, but as Bake frames it, as a cultural artifact. Something that reflects our history, our values.
Or maybe our lack of investment sometimes.
Yeah.
It reflects our regulatory choices too.
Definitely. So before we dive into the problems, maybe just quickly define the physical thing we're talking about. What is the grid, technically?
Okay, so physically, think of it as this huge continuous loop. It starts at the power plant, the generator.
Right, big power plants.
Then the electricity travels over those huge transmission lines, the really tall towers you see out in the countryside.
Okay.
Then it gets stepped down in voltage at substations, goes through transformers, those gray boxes on poles or green ones on the ground, and eventually makes its way through the distribution wires into your home, into the outlet. And critically, it's all connected. The loop essentially ends back at the generator. It's this dynamic, interconnected system.
But it's not just one big loop covering the whole country, is it? That's one of the first surprises.
No, absolutely not. That's a key point Bake makes. The U.S. actually runs on 3 distinct separate electrical grids.
What are they?
You've got the Eastern Interconnection. That covers, well, pretty much everything east of the Rocky Mountains. It's the biggest one.
Okay.
Then there's the Western Interconnection. That's the Rockies westward, and actually includes parts of Canada and Mexico too.
Right. And the third?
The third one is Texas, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. They have their own grid, separate from the other 2.
Texas going its own way, as usual. I always heard that was kind of a political statement, like keeping their options open historically.
Yeah, there's definitely that historical narrative. Like Quebec in Canada also manages its own infrastructure. But operationally, having these 3 separate unsynchronized grids today creates some major headaches.
What are the practical implications?
Well, the big one is you can't easily share large amounts of power between them. They aren't synchronized. They operate on slightly different frequencies, essentially.
So if there's, say, a huge heat wave in the east, they need more power.
They can't just instantly pull massive amounts from the west, where maybe solar is booming, or from Texas with all its gas plants. The connections between these grids, the DC ties, are very limited in capacity.
Ah, okay. So each grid has to mostly handle its own problems.
Pretty much. Within its own interconnection, power can be moved around relatively easily if there's a problem, like a plant going offline.
Yeah.
But between them, very difficult for large amounts quickly. And this is a huge bottleneck when you start thinking about integrating renewables.
Right, because wind in the Midwest might be useless to California if the Western grid is maxed out.
Exactly. Or vice versa. So you look at the infrastructure, the towers, the lines, and it looks sleek, modern. But as Bake quotes experts saying, underneath that surface, it's often like an old, beat-up, pothole-riddled, one-lane dirt road.
That's quite an image. An old dirt road holding up the digital age.
And that contrast, that tension between appearance and reality is really central to understanding the current crisis.
Okay, let's get into that crisis, that dirt road condition. The statistics you pulled from Bake's work are, well, they're pretty shocking.
They really are. Let's start with the age. Over 70% of the grid's transmission lines and the big power transformers are over 25 years old.
A quarter century old for most of it?
And that's just the transmission. If you look at the power plants themselves, the places actually making the electricity, the average age in the U.S. is over 34 years old.
Wow. So the machines making the power are even older than the wires carrying it, on average.
And this aging, combined with, let's say, decades of patchwork maintenance rather than systemic upgrades, it leads to massive inefficiency.
How inefficient are we talking?
Bake highlights that we actually rely on about twice as many power plants as we technically need just to meet our peak demand.
Twice as many. Why? just for backup?
Largely, yes, because the system's older, less reliable, and we need tons of redundant capacity sitting idle or running inefficiently just in case something fails, which it does frequently. Think about that duplication, the cost, the emissions.
It's staggering, and the direct consequence for us, the users, is reliability, right? Or lack thereof.
Absolutely. The U.S. has the highest number of outage minutes time without power of any developed nation.
Okay, quantify that. How bad is it?
The average American experiences about 6 hours of power outages per year. And here's the kicker. That number excludes major events like hurricanes or ice storms. This is just normal operational failures.
6 hours. Okay, how does that compare?
It's night and day. In Germany, the average is about 15 minutes per year. 15.
15 minutes versus 6 hours?
Yes. Japan, around 11 minutes. South Korea, about 16 minutes. We're talking orders of magnitude worse reliability here.
And it's not just more frequent, the outages last longer, too.
That's right. The average blackout duration in the U.S. is around 120 minutes, 2 hours, and Bakke notes that number is actually growing. In the rest of the industrialized world, the average outage is typically less than 10 minutes.
Okay, that disparity is huge. 6 hours versus maybe 15 minutes?
Yeah.
You mentioned geography earlier. Does our sheer size play a role that maybe Germany doesn't deal with?
Size and geography definitely add complexity, no question. More miles of wire, more exposure to diverse weather over vast areas. But Bakke argues forcefully, citing experts like Amory Lovins, that the primary driver is decades of what she calls protracted inattention.
Neglect, basically.
Pretty much. And it's not like nobody saw this coming. She points to a 1979 report by Amory and Hunter Lovins for the Pentagon.
1979, that's over 40 years ago.
Exactly. And this report explicitly warned the Pentagon that the fragility of the U.S. electrical grid was actually a greater national security threat than disruptions to imported oil supplies.
Wow. So the government was told, point blank, nearly half a century ago, that the grid was a major vulnerability. And yet, here we are. Why wasn't more done?
Well, it gets complicated, but a lot of it ties back to the regulatory structure of the utilities, especially the investor-owned utilities. For a long time, the regulatory model incentivized building new power plants, big capital-intensive projects that guaranteed a rate of return. Basic maintenance, upgrading old lines, burying cables. That was often seen as just an expense, not something that grew the rate base.
So the incentive structure favored expansion over upkeep?
Often, yes. Investment flowed towards growth, and maybe underinvestment in the existing, less glamorous parts of the system became normalized. That created this brittleness Bakke talks about.
And this brittleness, it's not always about massive storms or sophisticated attacks.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the most significant disruptions have incredibly mundane causes. Bakke mentions the NASDAQ stock market outages in 1987 and again in 1994. Know what caused them?
I think I remember this. Squirrels.
Squirrels. A couple squirrels chewing on wires took down the NASDAQ. Twice.
That's unbelievable.
But wait, it gets better. What do you think is the single biggest cause of power outages in the U.S. in the 21st century? Not storms, remember.
Equipment failure. Old transformers blowing up.
Nope. Overgrown trees.
Trees. Just branches hitting wires.
Exactly. Foliage management, or the lack thereof, is the #1 culprit for everyday power outages.
So we spend billions on cybersecurity for the grid, and the main enemy is a tree that needed trimming and a $5 squirrel.
It highlights the gap between perceived threats and the actual mundane vulnerabilities of this aging system. It seems comical, but the economic impact is huge, as we saw with that 2003 blackout figure.
$60,000 per hour per business lost. That's not comical at all.
Not at all. And to really grasp how we ended up with this specific kind of vulnerable centralized system, Bakke argues we have to go back to the beginning. How was this thing actually built?
All right, let's trace that history, because it wasn't always this massive centralized monopoly, was it?
No, far from it. In the very early days, electricity was super local. Think microgrids, though they didn't call them that.
Like for a factory.
Or university.
Exactly. Military bases, campuses, prisons, wealthy estates often had their own little power plants and distribution systems. Highly fragmented.
And the late 1800s, when public electricity started taking off, sounds like pure chaos based on Bakke's description.
Oh, it was the Wild West. You had multiple companies stringing wires, often literally on top of each other, over city streets. A black spaghetti tangle, as she puts it.
And no standards at all.
None. Different companies used different voltages, anywhere from 100 volts DC up to 2,000 volts DC. And then AC, alternating current, came along with its own variations of different frequencies, like 25 cycles per second, 60, 125. Imagine trying to buy a compatible appliance, or just the safety hazard of all those competing unregulated wires overhead.
Exactly. Then Thomas Edison arrives on the scene, launching the public electric age with his Pearl Street station in New York in 1882.
And his big idea was this centralized station using direct current, DC.
He sold these integrated grid kits, the dynamo generator, the wires, the light bulbs, all designed to work together. But DC had that fundamental limitation.
It couldn't travel far, right? That 1 mile limit you mentioned.
Yeah, the voltage drop was huge. So Edison's vision required a power station pretty much every mile or so in a city. Noisy, dirty, coal-fired plants dotted all over the place.
But Bakke points out something interesting here. Even though Edison was pushing this central station model, people actually seemed to prefer making their own power.
That's right. Between 1882 and 1887, while he licensed about 121 of his franchised central grids, he sold over 1,200 private, isolated plants directly to factories, mansions, big buildings.
So private generation vastly outnumbered central stations initially. People liked the independence.
They did, and even by 1907, years after the so-called War of the Currents between AC and DC was supposedly settled, Bakke notes only about 8% of American homes were electrified, and many of those were still running off private or hyperlocal systems.
So what changed, pushed us towards the massive centralized grid?
The big technological leap was alternating current, AC, developed around 1887 by people like Tesla and Westinghouse.
And AC's advantage was?
Two key things. One, it could travel much, much farther than DC without significant power loss, way beyond that single sad mile. And two, you could use transformers to easily step the voltage up for efficient long-distance transmission and then step it back down for safe use in homes and businesses.
So AC enabled centralization on a much grander scale.
Precisely. It was the technological key that unlocked the potential for a big grid.
But technology alone doesn't create a system. Bakke identifies a key figure who really architected the business and regulatory model we still live with today.
Yes, Samuel Insull. He was originally Edison's private secretary, then became the head of Chicago Edison, a brilliant, ruthless strategist.
What was Insull's core insight?
He saw the massive potential for economies of scale. Instead of dozens of small, inefficient power plants switching on and off, he envisioned one huge, highly efficient generating station running constantly, 247.
But to make that massive plant economical, he needed consistent demand, right? Not just everyone using power at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was his second key insight. Load balancing. Actively sought out different types of customers whose peak usage times were different,
Right.
like factories that used power during the daytime, streetcars that needed power during morning and evening commutes, and residential customers who used light mainly in the evening.
Ah, so he layered the demand to keep his big plant humming along steadily.
Precisely. By balancing the load, he could run his generators near peak efficiency almost all the time, dramatically lowering the cost per kilowatt hour. And that historical load balancing is, according to Bakke, why industrial customers still pay significantly less for electricity today. They provided that crucial, steady base load that made the whole centralized system viable.
Clever. But his biggest move wasn't just technical or commercial, it was political, wasn't it? This grow and build dogma led somewhere specific.
Yes. This is maybe Insull's most lasting legacy. He realized that building these huge, expensive central stations was a massive financial risk. What if a competitor built a station next door? What if regulations changed?
So he needed protection.
He needed protection. And he brilliantly co-opted the government and the concept of regulation for his own benefit. He argued that electricity was a natural monopoly and that competition was wasteful.
Okay.
So he lobbied, successfully, for state governments to grant his utility, and others like it, exclusive service territories, no competition allowed. In return, the utility agreed to be regulated on its prices and profits.
A deal with the devil, almost.
Monopoly status in exchange for oversight.
Pretty much. And this deal included crucial benefits for the utility, guaranteed rates of return on investment, which meant low-interest loans were easy to get for building more infrastructure, and protection from competitors. This cemented the model of the investor-owned utility, the IOU, as a state-sanctioned monopoly. So when I look at my electric bill today, and it's this baffling page of charges from a company I have absolutely no choice but to use, that's basically Samuel Insull's ghost.
That is the direct lineage, yes.
Yeah.
That structure, the monopoly provider, the guaranteed return on building stuff, the opaque pricing became the standard across the U.S. And for about 70 years, Bakke argues, roughly until the late 1960s or early 70s, the logic actually worked pretty well. Bigger plants were more efficient. Centralization did drive down costs. Electricity became cheaper and more abundant, and this created a really powerful cultural expectation in America
Which was?
that electricity should be cheap, absolutely reliable, always available at the flip of a switch, and provided by this single, invisible entity whose bill you just paid without really understanding it. It became like water from the tap, a public good you didn't question.
Until recently. Because that very rigidity, that one-way centralized design, is now clashing hard with 21st century technology, isn't it?
That's the crux of the current instability crisis. The grid was designed like a one-way street. A few huge power plants at one end, millions of passive consumers at the other. Simple top-down flow.
But things like rooftop solar completely mess that up.
Completely. Suddenly you have power flowing backwards onto the grid from thousands, potentially millions, of small sources. The grid wasn't designed for that two-way traffic.
And this isn't just a logistical problem, it's a physics problem, right? Bake really emphasizes the physics here.
Yes, electricity is fundamentally different from other commodities. You can't store it easily, like grain in a silo or, bananas in a box, as she says. It has to be generated the instant it's consumed.
It's a just-in-time system down to the millisecond.
Exactly. Production and consumption have to be in perfect balance across the entire interconnection, constantly. In North America, the grid is designed to operate at precisely 60 hertz, 60 cycles per second.
What happens if that balance is off, if generation doesn't perfectly match demand?
The frequency changes. If demand exceeds supply, the frequency drops. If supply exceeds demand, the frequency rises. And if it deviates too far from 60 hertz,
Bad things happen.
very bad things. Protective relays start tripping automatically to prevent equipment damage. Lines disconnect. Generators shut down. If the imbalance is severe enough, it can cascade into a blackout across huge regions as the system tries to protect itself from tearing itself apart.
And electricity doesn't just flow down the shortest wire, does it?
No, it follows all available paths simultaneously, governed by impedance, basically, the path of least resistance, which isn't always the shortest geographically. So an imbalance anywhere is felt everywhere, almost instantly, at nearly the speed of light.
Okay, so maintaining that perfect 60 hertz balance second by second is the constant challenge.
It is, and this is why integrating variable renewable energy sources, wind and solar, is such a headache for grid operators.
Right. Bake mentions former Energy Secretary Stephen Chu talking about his horror stories with renewables. What's the core paradox?
The paradox is that wind and solar are incredibly cheap when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining, but they are completely unpredictable and uncontrollable moment to moment.
So a cloud bank rolls over a huge solar farm.
And thousands of megawatts of generation can disappear in minutes. Or the wind suddenly dies down in a major wind corridor like the Columbia River Gorge, where Bake notes there's something like 6,000 megawatts of capacity.
And the grid operators have to react instantly.
Instantly. They have mere seconds or minutes to replace that lost generation to keep the frequency from crashing. And what do they typically use for that fast response backup?
Let me guess. The oldest, least efficient, dirtiest power plants they have.
Often, yes. Old natural gas peaker plants, sometimes even coal plants that were supposed to be retired, get fired up precisely because they can ramp up quickly to fill those gaps left by intermittent renewables. It's a really perverse outcome.
So renewables, in a way, can sometimes force more reliance on fossil fuels in the short term to maintain stability.
In the current system, without adequate storage or other flexibility measures, yes, that can absolutely happen.
But it's not just too little power that's the problem, right? Bake says too much power is just as dangerous.
Equally dangerous. Imagine the wind suddenly starts blowing incredibly hard across those thousands of turbines. You get a massive surge of power flooding onto the grid.
And the wires can't handle it.
Wires have limits. Too much power can overload transmission lines, damage transformers, cause voltage spikes. It could literally crash through the infrastructure, as Bake puts it. So the balancing authority, like the Bonneville Power Administration, BPA, in the Northwest.
They have to tell the wind farms to shut down, even when the wind is free.
Yes, it's called curtailment. They literally order turbines to stop spinning, even when conditions are perfect for generation, because the grid simply cannot absorb that much power at that location at that time.
That seems crazy. Why would a wind farm owner agree to not produce power when they could be?
Now we get to the financial incentives, which are often completely misaligned with the physical needs of the grid. Many of those wind farms were built thanks to federal subsidies, like the production tax credit. But often, those subsidies are only paid if the turbines are actually generating electricity.
So if they get curtailed, they lose the subsidy money.
Exactly. Or worse, they might have contracts requiring them to deliver power, and if they get curtailed, they might have to pay penalties or buy expensive power on the spot market to fulfill their obligation. So they have a huge financial incentive to push their power onto the grid, whether the grid can handle it or not.
It's a direct conflict between market rules and physics.
A fundamental conflict. And Bakke points out this grid fragility even dictates the kind of technology we deploy. The U.S. primarily uses smaller wind turbines, like 1.5 to 2 megawatt models.
Because the grid connections can't handle the bigger surges from larger turbines.
Precisely. Whereas in places like Germany, with more robust or modern transmission in some areas, they can deploy much larger, more efficient 7.5 megawatt turbines. Our grid limitations are literally capping the productivity of renewable energy sources. The system between generation and consumption is the bottleneck.
Which brings us inevitably to the holy grail, as Bakke calls it, grid-scale energy storage.
Yes. If you could cheaply store massive amounts of electricity, this whole balancing act becomes immensely easier. You could soak up excess solar during the day and release it in the evening. You could smooth out wind fluctuations.
But we can't really do that effectively yet, can we? What are the current options?
The vast majority, like 95% of grid-scale storage in the U.S. today, is still pumped hydro.
Pumping water uphill when power is cheap, letting it run down through turbines when power is needed.
Exactly. It works great. We have about 22 gigawatts of it, but it's totally geographically limited. You need mountains, reservoirs, water. Hard to build in Kansas or Florida.
Right.
Bakke mentions things like compressed air energy storage, CAES. There's a plant in McIntosh, Alabama that uses underground salt caverns to store highly compressed air, which is later released to spin turbines.
Interesting. Salt caverns, also pretty niche geographically.
Very. And there are thermal storage methods, like molten salt towers used with concentrated solar power plants. They store the sun's heat in liquid salt, which can then be used to generate steam and run turbines for hours after sunset, maybe even 24 hours.
So, clever solutions, but nothing universally deployable and cheap, like, say, building a gas plant.
Not yet. We don't have the equivalent of a massive, cost-effective battery that can provide duration hours or days of backup power that can be sited almost anywhere. And without that scalable storage, the grid remains trapped in this precarious real-time balancing act.
A balancing act that sometimes fails spectacularly, like the 2003 East Coast Blackout. Bakke uses this as a prime example of systemic failure.
It really is the textbook case. She describes it using the Swiss cheese model of accidents, multiple small failures lining up perfectly to cause a catastrophe.
And it started with something incredibly small, didn't it? Those trees again.
Yep. The initiating event was 3 overgrown trees in Akron, Ohio, sagging into high-voltage transmission lines owned by First Energy.
Just 3 trees hitting some wires.
Those lines tripped offline automatically, as they're designed to do. But then the electricity that was flowing on those lines instantly rerouted onto adjacent lines, following the path of least resistance.
Overloading those neighboring lines.
Exactly. But Bakke explains it's not just simple overload. The failure of those initial lines caused a sudden massive shift in the phase angle of the electricity across the eastern interconnection.
Phase angle. Okay, what does that mean?
Think of it like electrical pressure. Power flows not just from high voltage to low voltage, but also from areas with a leading phase angle to areas with a lagging one. When those lines dropped out in Ohio, it created this huge electrical sink, a low-pressure area causing power from all over the East Coast to surge towards Ohio like, as Bakke vividly puts it, tsunami-sized waves sloshing around in a bathtub.
A tsunami of electricity heading for Ohio. And the people supposed to be watching this.
They were blind. At First Energy's control center, a software bug had silently disabled their main alarm system. Worse, their monitoring screens, the ones showing the grid status, slowed down and eventually froze because the system was overwhelmed. They literally didn't see the cascade starting until it was way too late.
Unbelievable. A software bug at the worst possible moment.
That surge of power, uncontrolled, then overloaded more and more lines. 20 lines ultimately failed, tripping generators and causing a cascading failure that blacked out parts of 8 states and Ontario.
And the cost was immense, that $60,000 per hour per business figure.
Staggering economic losses. So the Swiss cheese model fits perfectly. You had the whole of deferred maintenance, the trees,
Right.
the whole of the software bug, the whole of inadequate operator tools, and the whole of the inherent physics of the grid all aligning. Boom.
It wasn't one single cause, but a system failing at multiple points.
Exactly. And this kind of slow degradation, the potential for unexpected failures, isn't just in the wires. Bakke also points to the aging fleet of large power plants themselves.
Like nuclear plants.
Yeah, she mentions the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant, where a cooling tower literally collapsed in 2007. Not due to an attack or earthquake, but because the wooden support structure had simply rotted away from neglect.
Rot. Holding up a cooling tower at a nuclear plant.
That same plant was later decommissioned after leaks of radioactive tritium were discovered. It highlights the immense cost and difficulty of maintaining these complex aging facilities.
And First Energy, again, with their Davis-Besse plant, that was another close call, wasn't it?
A very close call. They ended up spending over $600 million on upgrades after the Nuclear Regulatory Commission fined them $5 million, the largest fine ever at the time, for basically lying about a massive football-sized rust hole that had eaten almost entirely through the reactor vessel head. Only a thin inner lining prevented a potentially catastrophic loss of coolant accident.
So a combination of aging materials and, in some cases, deliberate obfuscation or cutting corners on maintenance.
It paints a worrying picture. Bakke noted that back in 2005, roughly 1/5 of all U.S. power plants were already over half a century old. And very few utilities outside of the government-owned Tennessee Valley Authority are building new large plants, nuclear, coal, or even big hydro anymore. The fleet is getting old.
And this aging infrastructure problem is colliding with financial pressures, particularly from rooftop solar, creating what Bakke and others call the utility death spiral.
Right, this is a huge structural challenge for the traditional monopoly utility model.
Explain that spiral. How does it work?
Okay, take a place like Hawaii. Bakke uses it as a prime example because their electricity costs are incredibly high, like 3 times the national average, mostly because they rely on expensive oil shipped in to generate power.
So in Hawaii, solar panels pay for themselves really quickly.
Exactly. So you get very high adoption of rooftop solar. Now, those homeowners with solar, they're generating their own power during the day. Great.
But they still need the grid, right? At night. Or if it's cloudy.
Absolutely. They are still connected 24/7. They push power onto the grid when they have excess. They pull power off the grid when they need it. They rely on the utilities wires, transformers, and backup generation constantly.
But they aren't buying as much electricity from the utility anymore?
Precisely. Their monthly bills plummet. But the utilities costs for maintaining the poles, wires, substations, all that shared infrastructure don't really go down. In fact, they might even go up because managing that two-way flow is more complex.
So the utilities revenue drops, but its costs stay flat or increase.
Right. So what does the utility do under the traditional regulated model? It has to go to the regulators and ask to raise the rates on its remaining customers, the ones without solar, to cover those fixed infrastructure costs.
Which makes electricity even more expensive for people who don't have solar.
Which makes solar look even more attractive to them. So more people switch to solar, the utilities customer base for selling kilowatt hours shrinks further, revenue drops again, they have to raise rates again.
And down the spiral you go, until the utility doesn't have enough revenue to even perform basic maintenance.
That's the death spiral. The traditional business model, based on selling volume through a monopoly infrastructure, simply breaks down when customers become producers and volume sales decline. It creates this crisis where needed upgrades become unaffordable under the old rules.
These failures, these crises, they did force a shift in thinking, though, didn't they? Bakke talks about a move towards resiliency.
Yes, especially after major storms like the Great Coastal Gale in the Pacific Northwest in 2007, and definitely after Superstorm Sandy hammered the Northeast in 2012, leaving millions without power for weeks.
People realized maybe the goal isn't just cheap power, but power that can survive a major blow.
Exactly. The focus shifted from just efficiency or independence to resiliency, the ability of the system to bend without breaking, to absorb shocks, and critically, to recover quickly when it does fail.
And this led to basically 2 different approaches, right?
Right.
The hard path versus the soft path.
That's a framework Bakke revisits, originally proposed by Amory Lovins back in the 70s. The hard path is about physically strengthening the existing centralized grid.
Like building stronger poles.
Yeah, replacing wood poles with concrete or galvanized steel. Elevating substations above floodplains, maybe even undertaking the incredibly expensive process of burying distribution lines underground, which protects them from wind and ice, but makes repairs much harder.
Okay, so Havard, what's the soft path?
The soft path, as envisioned by the Levinses, argued that large, complex, centralized systems are inherently brittle and vulnerable. They advocated for the opposite. Decentralized systems, smaller scale, local control.
More like the early days of electricity, almost.
In a way, yes, but updated with modern technology. Their argument was for local backup, local autonomy, and a preference for small over large scale. believing that a network of smaller, interconnected systems would be inherently more resilient, like an ecosystem.
And the modern expression of this soft path idea seems to be the microgrid.
Absolutely. Microgrids are really the soft path made real, enabled by advances in computing and control systems that didn't exist in the 70s.
So what defines a microgrid? How is it different from just having a backup generator?
A few key things. They're typically small, localized grids, usually under 50 megawatts. They serve a defined cluster of customers, maybe a campus, a hospital complex, a business park, or a neighborhood.
Mm.
They usually have multiple sources of generation on site, maybe solar panels, combined heat and power units, fuel cells, maybe some battery storage, possibly a diesel generator for backup.
Okay, multiple sources. What else?
The absolute key feature is that they can operate in two modes, connected to the main utility grid or islanded.
Islanded, meaning disconnected.
Exactly. If the main grid goes down, blackout, storm, whatever, the microgrid can automatically disconnect itself and continue operating independently, powering its local customers using its own generation and storage.
Ah, so it creates pockets of resilience.
Precisely. And critically, microgrids usually incorporate sophisticated load control. They can remotely and automatically shed non-essential loads like dimming lights slightly or cycling air conditioning units off for brief periods to keep their internal supply and demand balanced when they're islanded or when grid power is expensive.
That sounds incredibly useful. Who's adopting these?
The military is a huge driver, as Bakke points out. The Department of Defense sees microgrids as essential for energy security on bases. Imagine ensuring a critical command center or airfield stays powered, even if the entire regional grid collapses.
Right, mission assurance.
And it also simplifies logistics in deployed settings. Instead of trucking massive amounts of diesel fuel for generators, which is dangerous and expensive, building microgrids with renewables on forward operating bases reduces that reliance. Think about how much weight soldiers carry just in batteries. Local, reliable power is a game changer.
So microgrids are one piece. But Bakke also highlights another potentially huge piece of the soft path puzzle: electric vehicles.
Yes, vehicle-to-grid, or V2G. This is the idea that the millions of electric cars hitting the roads aren't just cars. They're essentially batteries on wheels. Big, mobile, distributed batteries.
How could they help the grid?
Enormously. If EVs are equipped with V2G capability, their owners could allow the utility or a third-party aggregator to draw power from their car battery during times of high demand or grid stress, and then recharge the car later when power is cheap and plentiful.
So my car could help power my neighbor's house during peak hours.
Potentially, yes. Aggregated together, thousands or millions of EVs could act as a massive virtual power plant, helping to smooth out those peaks and valleys in demand, stabilizing frequency.
And integrating more renewables.
Absolutely. That's maybe the biggest prize. V2G could soak up excess solar power midday or excess wind power at night, store it in car batteries, and then discharge it back to the grid when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. It could be a huge part of solving the intermittency problem.
It sounds like the perfect answer to that duck curve problem you mentioned earlier.
It really could be. Remember the duck curve? Solar power floods the grid midday, pushing demand way down the duck's belly. Then, as the sun sets, solar disappears just as people get home and turn everything on, causing demand to shoot up incredibly steeply, the duck's neck and head.
Requiring lots of fossil fuel plants to ramp up fast.
Right. VDG could solve that. Cars charge during the sunny belly part, then discharge during that steep evening ramp, reducing the need for those polluting peaker plants.
It sounds amazing. Is it actually happening?
The technology exists, but widespread adoption is still slow. Bakke notes that only about 1% of U.S. cars were plug-ins when she was writing. And not all EVs are VDG capable yet. Plus, the utility regulations and market mechanisms to compensate car owners are still being developed.
But the potential is there. Are there demonstration projects?
Yes. The military is again leading the way. Bakke mentions the Los Angeles Air Force Base having the largest V2G demonstration project at the time, using dozens of modified government EVs to provide power back to the base grid when needed. It proves the concept works operationally.
So all these activities, microgrids, VDG, smart thermostats, even small backup generators, they're happening at what Bakke calls the grid edge.
Exactly. The grid edge is that boundary, that interface between the traditional big utility grid and all these smaller customer-owned or locally controlled devices and systems. It's where a lot of the innovation and the conflict is happening now.
Which brings us back to culture, because all this grid edge technology bumps up against some deep-seated American attitudes about electricity, doesn't it?
It really does. Bakke argues Americans are culturally electricity-seeky, almost addicted to having abundant power, But simultaneously, we want the infrastructure to be completely invisible.
You want the magic, not the machine.
Right. Wireless charging, solar panels that look like roof tiles, power lines buried underground. We dislike the aesthetics of the physical infrastructure. We want it dematerialized, ambient, which makes building necessary new infrastructure, like transmission lines for renewables, incredibly difficult due to not in my backyard opposition.
And this desire for invisible, effortless power collided spectacularly with the utilities' attempts to bring intelligence to the edge, particularly with smart meters.
Oh, the smart meter backlash was huge. Bakke uses the Bakersfield effect as a key example.
Okay, remind us why the utilities wanted smart meters in the first place. What was the goal?
From the utility perspective, it was mostly about managing peak load and stabilizing revenues. Remember that peak demand issue, that tiny percentage of hours driving a huge percentage of infrastructure costs and pollution.
Right, the 2% of time using 10% of resources.
Smart meters would allow utilities to implement time-of-use pricing, making power much more expensive during peak hours, to incentivize shifting demand, or potentially allow the utility to remotely cycle high-load appliances like air conditioners off for brief periods during emergencies with customer consent, supposedly. It was about efficiency and cost control for them.
But that's not how customers saw it, especially in places like Bakersfield.
Not at all. The utilities roll these out often with poor communication, confusing new rate structures, and right into communities like Bakersfield that were already suffering from high unemployment during the recession.
And people's bills went up.
They skyrocketed, doubled, tripled in some cases, because the new peak pricing hit hard. Customers didn't see a tool for grid efficiency. They saw a sneaky rate hike disguised as technology.
And a surveillance device.
And a massive invasion of privacy. The idea that the utility could see detailed energy use patterns inside their home, or worse, remotely control their thermostat. It felt like Big Brother. There were huge protests, people demanding the old analog meters back.
It highlights the total lack of trust, doesn't it? Built up over decades of that opaque monopoly relationship.
Absolutely. The utilities had burned through all their trust equity. They tried to impose a technological solution without addressing the underlying social and economic context or the historical lack of transparency.
It's fascinating, though, that Bakke points out Americans are sometimes willing to pay more for electricity, but it depends on what they're paying for.
That's right. People will voluntarily pay a premium on their bill for green power programs, choosing to source their electricity from wind or solar, even though the actual electrons delivered to their home are indistinguishable from their neighbors' coal-powered electrons.
So it's not just about the lowest price. It's about values, accountability.
It seems so. There's a desire to align energy consumption with personal values, even if it costs more. People want to feel like they're part of a solution, not just passive consumers of an anonymous commodity.
And this idea of valuing something beyond the electron itself leads to maybe the most radical concept Bakke discusses for reshaping the grid, the Negawatt Revolution.
Ah, negawatts. Amory Lovin's brilliant term. It's such a simple but profound idea.
Explain it. What is a negawatt?
A negawatt is simply a watt of electricity not used due to efficiency or conservation. The revolutionary part is Lovin's argument that these avoided watts, these negawatts, should be valued and compensated at the same rate as generated watts, or megawatts.
So saving energy should be financially rewarded just as much as producing energy.
Exactly. If a utility spends $1 to build a power plant to generate a kilowatt hour, they should be willing to spend that same dollar, or maybe even slightly less, since efficiency is often cheaper, to help a customer save that kilowatt hour through insulation, efficient appliances, smarter controls, etc.
Bakke saw this in action at an Albertsons grocery store, right?
Yes, a great example. The store was redesigned with hyper-efficiency in mind. Advanced refrigeration, better lighting, windows, airflow management. It reduced its energy demand so dramatically that its small, on-site backup fuel cell could actually meet a significant portion of its regular needs.
And the manager was proud of.
He wasn't bragging about his generator. He was excited that his store had become a machine for making negawatts. He understood that the energy saved was a valuable resource.
The implications seem enormous. If utilities or grid operators actually paid customers or businesses for verified energy savings,
it would unleash a massive wave of investment in efficiency, which is almost always the cheapest, cleanest, and fastest way to meet energy needs. It fundamentally shifts the incentive structure away from just building more supply.
But it completely upends the traditional utility business model, doesn't it? Paying people not to buy your product.
That's the core conflict. The investor-owned utility model is based on selling kilowatt hours and building infrastructure to deliver them, earning a guaranteed return on those capital investments. Negawatts threaten both parts of that equation. It's why this concept is so contentious and faces huge resistance from incumbent power providers, even as regulators like FERC grapple with how to integrate demand-side resources fairly.
So the utilities are caught in this bind. As Big puts it, trying to overhaul the grid now is like
Rebuilding our entire airplane fleet, along with our runways and air traffic control system, while the planes are all up in the air filled with passengers.
an incredibly complex, risky operation with deeply entrenched interests resisting change. They can't really afford to keep the old system going without risking collapse, but they don't know how to transition to a new system without potentially destroying their existing business.
It's a profound systemic paralysis.
So we've journeyed through quite a lot here, from the grid's hidden fragility and its monopoly origins.
To the physics challenges of variable power, the failures like the 2003 blackout, and the rise of these potential solutions at the grid edge, like microgrids and V2G.
I think the crucial takeaway for you is that fixing the grid isn't just about inventing better batteries or smarter software. As Beck powerfully argues, it's fundamentally a legal, business, political, cultural, and even weather-driven puzzle.
Success isn't going to come from one magic bullet technology. It requires radically opening up the system to variety, embracing small-scale generation, storage, demand response, efficiency, and finding ways to integrate all these competing interests and technologies into a new kind of whole.
Bakke makes an interesting final point about American culture. We tend to prefer replacement over repair, don't we? If something breaks, we often toss it and buy a new one. We value shiny, new, perfect things.
Yeah, the broken pot analogy she uses. We sweep up the shards. We don't often celebrate the history or the repairs of an object. We want seamless performance, youth, perfection.
But the grid we have is inherently imperfect. It's old, it's patched together, it's full of compromises and flaws accumulated over a century.
So the provocative question Bakke leaves us with is, can we adopt a different cultural value? Maybe something more like the Japanese art of kintsugi.
Where broken pottery is repaired with gold lacquer, highlighting the cracks, making the repairs part of the object's beauty and history.
Exactly. Could we learn to appreciate a grid that is resilient precisely because it integrates its past, embraces necessary patches and workarounds, and values a functional, varied whole over an unattainable monolithic perfection? A system that learns to bend, that incorporates its history, rather than just trying to replace it wholesale.